Welcome. Good afternoon, colleagues. Hope you can hear me okay online and in the room. I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Rebecca Jovin. I'm the chief of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs in Vienna. And I'm really thrilled to be here today holding this event in our recurring Vienna conversation series at the historic Diplomatic Academy. It's our first time here. I hope not our last, Markus. I hope we'll be invited back. And I really want to start by thanking the Academy. Markus, of course, Melusine, who I don't think is in the room right now, all of the team behind the scenes for all the support. And as I said, I really hope it's just the start of a partnership. I want to equally thank the Austrian Research Association and, of course, the permanent mission of the Kyrgyz Republic to the international organizations here in Vienna, and in particular Ambassador Makeyev and Azaret, a good colleague at the mission here. We're really, really thrilled to be co-hosting this event with all of you. And I wanted to just start off with a few words about why we're here today. We recently celebrated two international days. Just last week was on the 5th of March, the International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Awareness. And as perhaps more of you know, the 8th of March was also International Women's Day. And the event that we've organized for today is connected definitely to both of those. I mean, you've seen it in the title. We're talking today about reducing the human cost of weapons through a gender lens. So really kind of looking at the issue of disarmament and gender issues together. And I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing from our distinguished panelists and researchers and practitioners. We've got some of them here. I've also seen Dragan on the screen. He's nodding so he can hear us, which is great. I'll leave the honor of introducing them properly to Markus, but I wanted to say thank you to all of them for being here and for sharing your insights and your recommendations. And I would equally defer to His Excellency, the Ambassador Makeyev, who will say remarks in a moment to give you a bit more of background on the international day that I mentioned, the International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Awareness. But just to say that it came to being thanks to an initiative of the Kyrgyz government. And since 2023, so now in the second year, we are marking it annually on the 5th of March, which those of you who are disarmament geeks and have studied your history books, you know that that is also the entry into force of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, so 5th of March, 1970. When it comes to the work, I think, of international organizations here in Vienna, at least I often hear people talk about Vienna as a nuclear non-proliferation hub. But really, issues of conventional weapons are also an essential part of the work of international and regional organizations based here and other partners, and we have them very much represented on the panel here today. And I'm really happy that we can shine light on this really essential element of disarmament and arms control today. When we look at the global picture, it is not a very pleasant one, a very optimistic one. We see rising tensions among and between states. We see unconstrained military spending, increasingly complex and intractable conflicts. And when we look at the armed conflicts in many parts of the world, it is illicit proliferation, diversion, and misuse of small arms and light weapons that really are most often at the heart of these conflicts and the violence that we witness. And according to recent data of another renowned research institution, the Small Arms Survey, in 2021, 45% or roughly half of violent deaths worldwide were committed by small arms and light weapons. And data also shows us, which I know our panelists will be addressing as well, that women, men, boys, and girls are impacted differently by small arms and light weapons. And actually, in fact, by all types of weapons, which suggests that gender disaggregated data and, importantly, policy and programming that responds to that reality is really, really crucial. Last year, the United Nations Secretary General published a policy brief called A New Agenda for Peace. And in that new Agenda for Peace, he really put arms control measures at the center of preventing conflict and violence and sustaining peace. And in it, he called for reducing the human cost of weapons. So very much at the core of our event and the title today. So I look forward to a rich discussion about how we collectively, as members of international organizations, governments, research and academic communities, civil society, can advance that goal. And just to say that invariably, as I see it, it requires holistic, very comprehensive approaches, and ones that integrate small arms control into other agendas, including development, including women, peace, and security, and bearing in mind the far-reaching consequences of such weapons, not just for peace and security, but for sustainable development and also for human rights. Education and empowerment are equally key elements. We're in an educational institution today. They're really the foundation, as I see it, for disarmament awareness and action. It's also a very core part of our work, of the work of my office here in Vienna. And it's also a component of bringing greater diversity of perspectives into disarmament decision-making, including, of course, women, young people. I see lots of young people in the audience, which is great, but also survivors and conflict-affected communities. So let me stop and express my thanks once again to our partners for this great collaboration. I look forward to a lively and rich discussion. I count on all of you, and I cede the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Makeyev. Thank you so much.
Thank you, dear Rebecca, distinguished Mr. Professor Dr. Kornprobst, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear participants. I'm pleased to welcome you to the event dedicated to a very important topic for current realities. 5th of March, the International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Awareness, declared by the UN General Assembly on the initiative of my country, the Kyrgyz Republic, on 7th of December 2022. Allow me to express my gratitude to the main organizers and UNODA. The Kyrgyz Republic pays great attention to strengthening peace and security, preventing and ending armed conflicts for the benefit of people, and raising awareness and understanding of disarmament issues among the public, especially young people. The annual celebration of the International Day is a positive impetus to intensify awareness raising and to integrate disarmament and non-proliferation issues into existing national general education programs at various levels. Since the beginning of the new millennium, modern society has been facing numerous and global crises and challenges, ranging from the world financial crisis, climate and environmental problem, COVID-19 pandemic, and today we have a rapidly changing global military political paradigm of peace. Since the beginning of the 20th century, the rapid development of technology has led the world community to seek disarmament in order to maintain international peace and security. Arms control, disarmament and non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction are more than ever on the international agenda. There is a need to educate the general public about the existing security architecture in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation, and the efforts made by UN member states, civil society, and NGOs to shape it and maintain world peace. The world community must realize that disarmament issues are not only a matter of politics between governments, but they also directly affect the interests and lives of ordinary citizens of these countries. Our main goal in the field of education is to equip people with the knowledge and skills to contribute to the implementation of concrete disarmament and non-proliferation measures and the ultimate goal of general and complete disarmament under effective international control. The Kyrgyz Republic, being committed to the maintenance of peace, non-violence, and the prevention of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, considers it important to continue the efforts of the international community in this area, in connection with which it was proposed to declare 5th of March International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Awareness. Disarmament and non-proliferation issues are a priority for the Kyrgyz Republic in the area of multilateral diplomacy. In December 2023, a memorandum of understanding between the Central Asian Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone and the African Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, which had been under negotiation for the past 4 years, was signed as part of the strengthening of multilateral non-proliferation arrangements. The signing of the memorandum will make it possible to develop cooperation between our zones in order to strengthen the global nuclear non-proliferation regime and unite international efforts to ensure peace and security. The Kyrgyz Republic calls for continued joint work for peace in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and international law. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take this opportunity to congratulate the female half of those present on this past International Women's Day. We believe that ensuring gender balance and equality and involving more talented women of young generation in disarmament and non-proliferation education will bring invaluable benefits to the world community. I thank you for your attention.
Ambassador, thank you very much. I also have the pleasure to welcome you to today's event on behalf of the Diplomatic Academy and on behalf of the Austrian Research Association. And my job is basically to moderate the event, but I can't help but say a few words at the beginning, and I promise to be brief. As part of our work in the Austrian Research Association, we have done a lot of things on disarmament. So wrote books and articles and special issues and all about that. And the message there, obviously, and the previous two speakers, they formulated that already perhaps a little more diplomatically than I do. I'm a social scientist. I don't have to be all that diplomatic all the time. Yeah? But the situation about disarmament, we should really keep that in mind, is dire. Yeah? So when we look at statistics, import, export, CIPRI data out now, new, then we're not moving towards a world with fewer weapons, but we're definitely moving towards a world with more and more weapons and deadlier weapons. And I think because of that, it is obviously very important to discuss issues on disarmament. And I think because of that, it's also very important to discuss issues about the human costs of weapons. And the way how I see that, and I'm gonna juxtapose it a little bit to the new agenda for peace in a second. Yeah, it's really a paradigm. So on the one hand, you have national security, and national security considerations ultimately don't really care about human beings, especially if they're not of their own nation. Yeah. Human cost of weapons really directs your analytical gaze and your normative gaze towards looking at what is happening to people in conflict. And I think that's a very, very important point. The way how this is framed at the moment is probably by Antonio Guterres' new Agenda for Peace. And there, the formulation of human costs of conflict appears under the heading of preventing conflict and violence and sustaining peace. So conflict prevention and basically something like peace building. And then the document formulates one action, that's action 7. The whole document formulates 12 actions. And the diagnosis there in this action is that, I'm going to quote, at the heart of our peace and security engagement is a commitment to save human beings from violence, end quote. I think that's a very, very important point. The cure then suggested is to regulate small arms and light weapons. That too, I think, is one very important cure. Yeah? And as Rebecca has mentioned beforehand, it's really about half of casualties in armed conflict that stems from small arms and light weapons, and it's very easily overlooked. But if this human cost of weapons really is more than simply a way of understanding small, light, and armed weapons, if it's something like a paradigm that you look at and you juxtapose that to national security, then you can probably think of all kinds of other issues where small arms, light weapons are still very important, but you go beyond that. Yeah? And one of them, the ambassador mentioned in this talk, weapons of mass destruction. There, obviously, the human cost is enormous. Yeah? The actual human cost that has happened already with biological weapons, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, but of course, even more so if we think about the potentials. Yeah? And then I think another really important point in that is that when we look at modern weapon systems, and when we look at the modernization of weapon systems, then we do come across now semi-autonomous and autonomous weapons. We will do so more and more in the future. And what does that actually mean in terms of the human cost of weapons? And that obviously can be enormous and has all kinds of important moral and ethical implications. And I'm obviously not the first one to say that, very, very far from that. So if we look at documents, policy reports, for instance, by International Committee of the Red Cross, Oxfam, and everything, they pointed out quite strongly and I think quite convincingly. It's also interesting that there's a forthcoming conference organized in the Hofburg here in Vienna by the Austrian Foreign Ministry with the title Humanity at the Crossroads, Autonomous Weapon Systems and the Challenge of Regulation. Yeah? They too, in their blurb, use this formulation of the human costs of weapons. Yeah? So again, in my opinion, it's a very, very important issue because it's more than just one of many concepts. It's really a paradigm. It's a way of looking at weapons. It's a little bit like if I take off my glasses and I look at a different world, and I think that is what the human cost of weapons is, in my opinion. I'm going to stop here because I've abused my role, and I should actually simply introduce the speakers to you. I'll do so very briefly because they have fantastic expertise, and I don't want to take time away from what they have to say. They're going to give a very brief presentation, something like 5 minutes, each of them, and then we have ample opportunity to discuss and for you to ask questions. So to my left is Federica Dall'Arche. She is a Senior Research Associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, obviously a very important organization here in the city of Vienna, located very close to the Vienna International Center. She has ample experience, advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in Italy. She's also co-founder of the Young Women and Next Generation Initiative under the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. And please join me to welcome her cordially to this event. And then to my right is Fabrizio Sarrica. He is research officer under the Research Innovation and Partnership section, Research and Trends Analysis branch of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. And one of the many things that he does, he is the lead author of the UNODC Global Reports on Trafficking in Persons since its first edition in 2009. And Fabrizio, I have to admit that I've used this report very often in my own research. One of the book projects on the Horn of Africa is very important work that you do there. And then we have joining us online Dragan Božanić, a gender specialist in the United Nations Development Program, more appropriately put in the Southeastern and Eastern Europe Clearinghouse for the control of small arms and light weapons. Dragan, amongst other things, is an author of several reports on gender aspects of small arms control and practical tools for gender mainstreaming and gender analysis in the small arms context. And I think beforehand, with all my enthusiasm, I forgot the round of applause for you. So now we have to do a double one. Now we have to do a double one for our experts here. And then I suggest that we simply move into the presentations, something like 5 to 7 minutes. And Federica, you're the first.
Thank you so much, Markus, and thanks so much also to Rebecca and all the UNODA team for this kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be at the Diplomatic Academy. So thanks again for the kind invite. I was asked to reflect and possibly talk about the benefits of involving women in non-proliferation, arms control, disarmament processes. And I hope you'll forgive me if I'll start by being a bit provocative in this sense, but I think it's a bit problematic to think about or frame the involvement of women in these processes or in any processes in general with the key of thinking of benefits, and I'll explain myself. Women compose 50% of the world population. Women are impacted as much as men by negotiations, by armament and disarmament processes. So their involvement should not be seen as a concession or something that is given. Talking about benefits in this sense, or involving women in terms of benefits, really follows that idea that someone has the power to decide whether women should be involved or not. And I think this should not be the case. It's only fair that women are involved and have the same authority to decide on certain discussion and decisions. That being said, I recognize that there are some skeptical still. And so it's important to highlight what the benefits are of involving women and having diverse delegations and an increased diversity in negotiating processes. There is a very interesting and I would say actually groundbreaking study that was published in 2016 by UN Women and the Geneva Graduate Institute. And this study has analyzed over 40 negotiation processes and has demonstrated that those delegations that were gender balanced had way higher chances to reach agreements, and also demonstrated that those agreements that were negotiated by gender balanced delegations were agreements that were more durable and long lasting. Other studies followed this study. There was another one that brought the number to over 80 peace agreements and negotiations and confirmed these findings. So what does this tell us? It tells us that, well, first of all, having an homogeneous group that decides for everybody is really not a very strong and efficient strategy. Having a diversity challenges people to think outside the box, challenges people to understand that there are different viewpoints, there are different upbringings, and therefore there are different needs that need to be addressed. And so it is important to have diverse delegations for this reason. And there's also another reason. Having women participating in negotiation processes, it's not, should not follow the reason that women are more prone to peace or more peaceful. This is a stereotype. There are no reputable studies that talk or demonstrate that women are by nature more peaceful and men are less peaceful. But from a very young age, women are taught to behave a certain way, more cooperatively, less aggressively, to in a way, exercise their empathy. And this has, of course, strong results in negotiation processes. So I think I'll leave it like at here from now, but happy to elaborate more later.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to move over to Fabrizio.
Yes, I have well, first of all, a word of gratitude to the organizers, so Rebecca, the UNDA, and the Diplomatische and Markus. I'm very grateful for you to be here. I represent the research and trend analysis branch of UNODC. Yes. Now our organization is dealing with drugs and crime, the research and trend analysis branch. We collect data, analyze data, write studies, reports about a wide variety of crimes and drugs issues. So I was asked to discuss and present briefly some of the results emerging from our research, especially the studies that we recently conducted in the field of homicide, with a specific booklet on the femicides and the connection with the firearms. Yes, one of the key findings emerging from our global study on homicides and the specific booklet on the femicide. 80% of all homicides around the world are mainly affecting males, so men and boys. And when we talk about homicides, that is a proxy for violence. We see that most of the perpetrators and most of the victims are actually males, but 20% of the homicides recorded in 2022 are affecting women and girls, and this share is actually increasing. In 2022, we recorded the highest number of female victims of intentional homicides. And this is more alarming if we consider that in 2022, actually, we recorded a decreasing trend of the overall homicides. So we have more women killed by intentional homicides in absolute numbers and also in relative terms. About half of these victims are, let's say, killed by intimate partners. So while males are more affected or killed in terms of organized crime killings or systemic violence connected to the drugs market, for instance, if we look at intimate partners killings, then female are the most affected victims. There are, of course, wide regional differences. We see decreasing numbers in Europe. We see decreasing number in Latin America, even if we started from, let's say, high numbers. But we see increasing numbers in North America and other parts of the world. If we look at the regional variations, what is emerging from our estimates referring to 2022, it's Africa is the main area of concern, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. So if we look at the number of victims for for population. And of course, the issue with countries in Africa and also with some parts of Asia is that we lack of data. So these numbers can actually can represent all just the tip of the iceberg, because many of these homicides where women are mainly where victims are women may be unreported. When we look at the connections of the firearms and in the homicides and femicides, well, again, most of the victims of the homicides are men, and this is even more true. So it's more acute when we look at homicides committed with firearms. So firearms is and violence and the use of firearms is strictly connected also with males and masculinity. When we look at intimate partners homicides, well, the use of firearms in this context is less frequent if we compare it to organized crime or to drugs-related homicides. Nevertheless, we see that also in this context, we see that when that is more frequent, men killing women, then more frequently firearms are used. When on the other, women are killing the intimate partner that is a man, then in this case, more frequently is used a knife. So again, the use of firearms is mainly connected with a male perpetrator. I will just a broad picture that could lead us also to draw some policy considerations is that it's clear from our research that a key factor contributing to homicides is access to and misuse of firearms. So the use of firearms and the availability of firearms amplifies the severity and the scale of homicides. About 47% of all homicides around the world, so not only in conflict scene like what was described by the small arms surveys, but overall is committed by use of firearms, but there we see broad regional differences. So in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, the homicides by firearms, it's around 60 or more than 60%. In Europe is between 10 and 20%. In Asia is between 15 and 20%. So I would say that in this case, the area of concern remained the Western Hemisphere. And again, it's clear that an increased rate of possession of firearms correspond to an increase in the homicide rates. This is one of the conclusion, strong conclusion that our research would highlight. Just one point to close is that we also conduct research in the context of armed conflict, and I would echo some of the things that were that I think Markus, you highlighted the fact that we have to also go beyond the use of firearms and the issue of security. When we look at armed groups, we see a broad range of victimization. So, for instance, we work a lot with our DPO colleagues and the missions, the peacekeeping operations in the field. And one of the research that we have conducted together shows that at least 5,000 children were recruited by armed groups, militias, only in the year 2020 to exploit and recruited for, let's say, to be used as combatants, mainly boys. But also in these territories, at least 1,200 girls have been reported to be victims of gender-based violence, and mainly by militias or armed groups. also by national army and police forces, and this is, of course, even more of concern because for the obvious reasons. And thank you very much, and happy to discuss.
Thanks a lot. And then we have one more speaker with a brief talk, and that is Dragan. Now I can see you again.
Yes, good afternoon from my side, colleagues, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be with you today, even if just online. I have also prepared like a couple of slides. Let me just start my intervention with some of the key data from the region, which basically very good built on what was already said, and which illustrate what is the scale of the challenges that we are facing. In Southeast Europe, out of all legally owned firearms by civilians, more than 97% belong to men. Men are also several times more likely than women to say that they would own a gun, and this particularly holds true for young men, who are the group which has the most positive attitudes towards firearm ownership. Our data also show that when it comes to perpetrators of firearm-related incidents, that is to say to misuse of firearms, men again account for more than 98% of perpetrators. Men also account for the majority of victims, as the 75%. Women, on the other hand, own only a minor share of firearms, hardly ever misuse it, but are disproportionately represented among victims. And the reason for their overrepresentation among the victims is clearly related to the misuse of firearms in domestic violence, and particularly in intimate partner violence. The data that we are regularly collecting is showing us a very stable trend in the region. And that is that the more, when we take a look at in which context are people being killed with firearms, then we see that more people are being killed in domestic violence than in any other type of incident, including criminal context. And of course, this very disproportionately affect women. And you can see from this slide how women and men face very different risks depending on the context in which firearms are misused. In Southeast Europe, out of all women killed with firearms, more than 80% are killed by their family members. This data basically shows how each and every aspect of firearms is highly gender, and the gender, including also some specific notions of masculinity, fuel demand and misuse of firearms, but also shape the specific risks that women and men are facing. And consequently, if we really want to control the proliferation and reduce the misuse of firearms, then gender perspective should not be just an add-on, but a very essential part of every small arms and light weapons control efforts. But in practice, this is not necessarily the case. For instance, in 2016, we conducted a comprehensive regional analysis of small arms legislation and policies in order to see what is the policy response to this highly gendered nature of firearms. And what we found out is that basically these frameworks are mostly overlooked the gender aspect of small arms. They overlook this differentiated impact on women and men, and that also they didn't question how gender norms and roles and notion of masculinity can shape risk-taking behaviors. Ever since then, we have been working in close cooperation with institutions in the region to change these trends, and we are and our overall approach is based on 4 pillars. Our absolute priority is working on the capacity building of institutions in charge of small arms control to integrate the gender perspective in their work. I think that this is of crucial importance because they are the ones who are mandated with the implementation of the relevant legislation and strategies, and we as an international regional organization can really support them in this process. Then what is also in our focus is research and data collection, because having such data has really enabled us to make a strong case for the practical gender mainstreaming in small arms control, and also has enabled us to steer the discussion on the issue. What is also on top of our priority is increasing the participation of women in small arms control policy making and also implementation, because we still see that in the region as elsewhere that this is the area still heavily dominated by men, which can also affect how the policy will look like and what will be the policy outcomes. And last but certainly not the least, we are implementing diverse raising awareness activities, how to inform both decision makers but also general audience about these linkages between gender and small arms and main risks. What we see that as a result of all these efforts, we really see the shift in the paradigm from this gender blind approach to increasingly gender responsive solution. And it is, for instance, mostly visible in the new generation of small arms control strategies and action plan adopted across the region, which now not only recognize the gender dimension of small arms, but also try to come up with some practical measures of how to address different aspects, including the linkages between firearms and domestic violence, and for instance, exposure of young men to armed violence. What's currently our focus is really on supporting the institutions in the region, how to translate these policy commitments in the region, and we are working very intensely on the mainstreaming gender at operational small arms and light weapons control. And for instance, we are now developing specific tools and training, such as the one for assessing and addressing risks of firearms misuse and domestic violence for police officers, or how to take, for instance, the gender perspective into account when firearm license approval are being considered. So I will stop here and then happy to discuss further.
Dragan, thank you very much. And then I think we can move to the interactive part. And so I think there were 3 very stimulating presentations, very thought-provoking presentations, with quite a bit of data as well. Very important, of course, to always have that in mind. And so whoever wants to ask a question, go ahead. And if I see quite a few hands up, which I don't see yet, then I would bundle questions. If it's just one, then I would go one by one. I think there are quite a few up. So I'm going to bundle 3 questions, okay?
Sure.
So, and just identify yourself very, very quickly, and perhaps whether it's for the whole panel or a particular speaker. Please.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very interesting. And my name's Julia, and happy for any of the panelists to respond to my questions. So I really loved hearing both the data that you all presented and then some possible strategies to reduce gender-based violence. But of course, I would love to hear more, do you and your work address the sort of systematic patriarchal system that not only is, of course, hurting women, but as we saw even from the data, resulting in a lot of men also ending their own lives. I know, men mostly commit suicide by gun as well. So how much do you actually address the sort of foundational system that we live in where, it says, as you said, Federica, like, why are men socialized that they are violent? Why are women socialized that they're peaceful? Why don't we also address that basis first before we, of course, take those very, specific steps that you all laid out also in your research findings? Thank you.
Thank you. Then Leander.
Sorry. Hello, my name is Leander. I'm a student here from the Diplomatic Academy from Germany. I wanted to ask Ms. Dall'Arche about, because you talked about the agreements, about the study 2016 about women involved in negotiations and that they had a higher success rate. Wanted to ask if they could also see a difference in the content of these agreements and in the longevity of these agreements. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the time being? Yes, please.
Peter Reckwood is my name. I'm intrigued to know the origin of the weapons that seem to be so abundant. Any responses to that would be interesting, please.
Okay, thank you. So I think, Federica, I'm going to hand over to you because there were a couple of them explicitly addressed to you, and then we're going to go on to Fabrizio and to Dragan.
Absolutely. Just apologies, I didn't understand the question from the gentleman in the front.
I think it was, it was basically why is there such an abundance of weapons, I think.
Oh,
but,
okay.
But it's better if you...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Well, I will start with the difference and longevity of the peace agreements. So the studies that UN Women has conducted together with the Geneva Graduate Institute was focusing mainly on peace negotiation processes. So in the context of a conflict, what worked and were there any differences if women were involved in these negotiation processes? And the answer was yes. They started, as I said, from, I believe, conflicts from 1989 to 2014, so over a long period of time. And they demonstrated that the peace agreements that they were negotiated by the delegations that had women, that included women, were, again, not only, the chances were not only higher to reach an agreement, but these agreements were long-lasting, more long-lasting and more sustainable. And why? Because of what we've discussed before, so the fact that women are taught in a way to act more empathetically, I would say, and more cooperatively, but also because in virtue of this behavior, there are also those who are in the field and are more, again, this is the context of conflicts. So, for instance, the FARC in Colombia, they were those agents that had more information on the ground, and so they were also able to perhaps lend a more listening ear to the other side of the negotiating table. And for the second, I hope that responded to your question. But it's a very interesting study, so I would suggest to look it up. And to the second question, how and do you address or do you fight the patriarchal system in your work? I think that's a task that everybody has to do. And in our little sphere at the VCDMP, in cooperation with the Istituto Affari Internazionali, which is a center in Italy, and in the framework of the EU Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium, we've created an initiative that is called Young Women Next Generation Initiative. And among the tasks of this initiative is really, this initiative was really created with the goal of dismantling the patriarchal system and increasing the number of women in non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament processes. And so through this initiative, for instance, we organize events. We've also created a mentorship program. Some of our mentees are here today, and mentors as well. But we really try to, give a different perspective. We've organized webinars, for instance, and the latest one that we've organized was, I want to say 2 weeks ago, and it was very interesting, talking about the 12 lessons, feminist lessons of war. So we're just in our small sphere, we're not changing the world, right? But in our little work, we're trying to make a difference and expose young students, young professionals to, the other side of the coin.
Thank you. Fabrizio, is there anything that, yeah?
Yes, no, maybe I can comment also on what we are doing as, let's say, agency or as organization on that, from that angle. So I would say that, you know, Gutierrez, since the first day Gutierrez got on board, the gender perspective was at his really at the core of his activity. And I would say we really feel it on our daily implementations on our activities, both in in a broad range of. We also have, let's say, incentives to promote gender equality in the implementation of the projects, and it's actually mandated in the implementation of our project to have a clear gender perspective, and in a variety of activities that goes from the human resources to the trainings to workshops that we conduct. On the question on the gentleman concerning the proliferation of weapons, why there are so many weapons available. Well, from a criminological perspective, I would say there is a market. So there is the supply and the demands. The demand is, of course, connected to mainly, broadly, to main issues, that is conflict-driven and crime-driven. And on the conflict-driven, of course, this is not my field of expertise, but we see there is a proliferation of conflicts at a global scale in different parts of the world. And the same probably at the crime, that is more my sphere of expertise. We have seen for years a decrease in the number of homicides at global level, of course with regional differences. What we have seen, let's say, the post-COVID world, we have seen a spike in the homicides that is now reducing, as I said, with the exception of female victims of intentional homicides. In the 2022, we have seen a reduction, but the overall trends is that the post-pandemic activities have seen a more violent criminal activity worldwide. So that is, of course, alarming. Yeah.
Thank you. Dragan, do you want to add something?
Yes. Well, I can very briefly reflect on the first question. And I think that one of the really most important value added of mainstreaming gender in small arms control is that it becomes very clear and visible that our efforts to have effective small arms control can be very futile if we don't address the wider context, the wider social context which produces, which fuels proliferation, and particularly within this context, to address the patriarchal structures which generate some specific notions of masculinity, which we see in the practice are really linked to the demand for firearms. What research in the region, but not only in the region, I would say that also in other geographical contexts show is that the reason why firearms have such a special appeal and strong appeal for some group of men is that they deliver very effectively on the power and control, which are a very central category for the man experience and in which men are being socialized, and I would say that men are conditioned to seek power and control. This is not that easy to address in the practice, of course, but from the perspective of our mandate, which is really focused on small arms and light weapons control, we are implementing several activities. First of all, we are implementing target awareness raising campaigns, which are specifically targeting some groups which are most at risk, including the young men in order to somehow practically decouple men from firearms and to promote other less risky taking behaviors. And the other avenue of our work is really related to broadening the scope of the stakeholders who are given voice and who participate in small arms control. And for instance, we are increasingly cooperating with civil society organizations, particularly with women's organizations and organizations promoting gender equality in order to ensure that their perspective also impacted the developments in the region.
Dragan, thank you. And we can move on to the next round of questions. Yes, 1, 2.
Thank you for the discussions. I'm an economics student over here at a different school, however, and when it comes to armament and conflicts, I see that countries are turning to aggression if they do not see their interest in any other way protected, not economically and not diplomatically. So, in my mind, and please argue with this if you disagree, that we are motivating them in armament and aggression if we are isolating them in the diplomatic field or in the economic field. And is there any, if you agree with this statement, is there any best practice how to demotivate such countries or any entities in arming, given the fact that the military industry doesn't produce any output for the society that would increase standard of living and quality of life? So if it's true that isolation, economic and diplomatic isolation, is motivation for aggression, what can be done against it in general? Thank you.
Big questions, yes, thank you.
Thank you. Hello again. My name is Andreas. I'm a second-year MI student here at the Academy, and I think my question is most likely fitting for Fabrizio, actually. Just before the events of the 7th of October 2022, there have been some advanced talks between Israel and Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think, about the establishment of diplomatic relations between the countries, which would have been very good for peace, I suppose, because those three are the biggest regional players. So there's this theory that the events of the 7th of October was like a direct response to those talks, as groups such as Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthi rebels are not really interested in peace, as they would lose their position or their relevance if it came to disarmament. So if that's so, like, what do you think about that? And if it rings true, how would you approach that? Thank you.
That will be a hard question for the panelists, I think, but it's okay. Thank you. Yes, Charlotte.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm also a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. I'm currently writing my thesis on queer refugees. And my question would be, is there one of the issues I'm running into is that there's a lot of talk about gender mainstreaming, but the focus is on women and children only. Is there any talk about looking at people of color or queer refugees, or not queer refugees, but queer people in general? For example, a lot of trans people tend to be more discriminated against than someone who is, so to say, straight passing. Is there any motivation to find data regarding other marginalized people, or is that not in the consideration? Thank you.
Got it. Thanks a lot. Then we have bundled three questions again, and perhaps again in the order in which we started. And Federica, you'd be first.
Sounds good. How do we disincentivize countries to army, and how do we avoid isolation? Well, I think the response to that is really diplomacy, and the current geopolitical environment right now, it's particularly difficult. We have two active conflicts, and obviously even the idea of engaging the aggressors in one of these conflicts seemed to be particularly difficult. But I guess the short answer to your question to me is really diplomacy. Yeah, it's a difficult question, but it is true that isolation doesn't help. But through keeping channels of communications open and maybe establishing, with arms control is a completely different type of beast from disarmament, but it's also a way to establish channels of communication and to establish confidence and trust building measures with your enemy. Well, trust is a big word, but at least a way to make sure if you, for instance, have a knowledge of how many weapons your enemy has, you are in a position of making certain assumptions and making certain even strategic actions and strategic analysis. So again, I think it's an answer that requires a complete different conversation, but I think diplomacy is the short answer to your question. But I'll be happy to talk more, maybe bilaterally on this. And the other question that I wanted to address was the one regarding studies highlighting the queer and diversity, not only highlighting gender mainstreaming in terms of women and children participation. And I'm happy to say that there are a lot of studies that are doing this. I've wrote a chapter a couple of months ago on gender in arms control, and while I was conducting my research, I was able to find a lot of resources highlighting this. For instance, in the context of the war in Ukraine, one of the most concerning things is that a lot of people who identified with a different gender from that was assigned to them at birth were among the highest number of victims of the conflict. They didn't have access to medical care. They needed medical care, or for instance, in Ukraine there is, I think, still is forced conscription for men, meaning that men cannot leave the country. But then there were a lot of situations in which, on paper, an individual was identified as a man, but in practice, he identified or she identified as a woman. And so she was unable to leave the country for this reason. This is just an example to say that there are a lot of there is a lot of interesting data on this. And I think the European Union also has published I don't want to say extensively, because there's always room for research and publication, but there are some resources out there that I'll be happy to share with you.
Thank you, Fabrizio.
Yes. So on the questions on the 7th of October, I really not in a position to answer, in the sense that UNODC, as the UN Organization on Drugs and Crime, we don't have special, particular insights or information about, the background. So I don't have, let's say, any added value. I cannot give any added value by, providing, my own personal opinion. So I assume maybe the historians will tell us more in the future. But yeah. I don't have a particular answer to that. On the data disaggregation, yes, we actually, you mentioned we also produced the global report on trafficking in persons, and over the last 2 editions of the global report, the last one we published in 2022, for the first time, we produced statistics on the victims of trafficking, transgender victims of trafficking in person, mainly exploited in sexual exploitation. And we drafted also on the base of official information, on the base of qualitative analysis, special representation of the trafficking patterns of these victims. And we would like, of course, to go beyond and also to include other disaggregation, but of course there are constraints in terms of the origin of the source of the data is most of the time limited. So the quality of our research is based on the quality of our data. Thanks.
Thank you. Dragan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can very briefly say that when it comes to intersectional data, that is still a big challenge to collect such data from institutions. And for instance, when we were collecting the data for small arms and light weapons service, we asked also institutions who are collecting this administrative official data, and we tried to collect some insight on the LGBTI persons, but actually there was no such data generated by institutions, which of course reflect the challenge that those persons are facing and also their legal status. However, what we are trying is to bridge this gap by organizing a focus group discussion and trying to collect some more quantitative data. So far, the focus has been, for instance, on collecting the data on some specific group of women, such as women on disability or rural women which face specific risks when it comes to firearm issues. But we also plan to engage more on collecting the broader intersectional data in the region.
Thank you, Dragan. Then we can do one more round of questions. Who still wants to? Otherwise, I'm going to abuse my... Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Norton. Sorry, and I'm from Namibia. So maybe I have a bit long intro.
No half an hour, but
okay. But this is a very complex talk because I think it's on 3 layers. You have the domestic layer in a home and communities. Then you have the national layer of crime and violence, and then you have the big boy with nuclear weapons and disarmament on that level. And how I track this topic, especially disarmament of small arms, and here I'll have to come down to, and that's why I just said I had to start explaining myself, to the domestic level and that of the national level. I have the opinion that I find that women pay the price again in this domestic, in this discussion on disarmament, especially on the domestic level. I mean, I come out of a home where I was an 8-year-old boy and woke up to the screams of my mum being beaten once by my dad, and I never saw it again in my family. But you know, as growing up as a boy, you know, having to stop, having to watch out for this, motivate other men not to do this. You know, I think we still don't have tools of reducing the number of violence, especially with firearms towards women. And I think we are still not doing enough to put women at the forefront of, you know, facing this brunt. The second part, I think, with the small arms, disarmament of small arms, it is again women that suffer this the most on a national level as well. You know, if you're looking at communities that live in the bush, for example, that get marauded, their children get kidnapped, it's women that again suffer. So sorry that I'm mentioning this, but I do think that there should be a lot more focus on women and their needs, and get from women exactly what is it that they want as an outcome. And I think this conversation is somehow masked very much when we talk about gender, because now we're mixing everybody else also in again, and women again suffer. So sorry for the long comment, but this is, a view that I have, that we are still not doing enough, and putting women at the forefront as really suffering. We're seeing it through the statistics. And we should really, again, have almost a recalibration on that.
Yeah, no, thanks.
And taking into conversation with what previous speakers were talking about, gender in that context. So that's the comment.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your contribution. You asked a question already. I'm just going to go for someone who, I know you have as well, right? Yeah. Then there we have someone who hasn't yet. And then maybe the two of you bilaterally. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. After, because I also have to ask a question that I really have to ask. Good.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Amanda. I'm from Central European University. I wanted to know a bit more about the UNODC report on gender killing. It showed a huge disparity between the regions on women and girls affected by gender-related killing. According to the data available, you mentioned a high number in Africa. Can you talk a bit more about it, the causes, and how to address it? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and then let me abuse my position as a moderator to ask a question as well. This. With all of this, and I'm going to put it a little drastically probably, yeah? So I'm a really very, very big believer in the United Nations, in particular in anything that has to do with the Secretariat and agencies and bodies and everything, and also the General Assembly, perhaps a little less of the Security Council. And one of the reasons is actually events like this, right? So I think that there is a lot of progressive thinking coming, in particular, from the Secretariat and everything around it. But a question that I'm always asking myself is when we look then at reality, so when we look at conflict zones and everything, what is it actually that changes? So what is it in more concrete terms that it changes? And maybe just one example there. And don't get me wrong that I do think that it has potential for a peaceful change and everything. Yeah? But just one example. So when Guterres situates now human costs of war basically in the peace building sphere, yeah? Then definitely one of the problems that we have is that these negotiations are usually, these peace negotiations are totally exclusive, right? They are the exact opposite of inclusive. So there's this very bad joke, something like, this is really not a joke, you will not laugh, it's actually just horrible, but so if a man kills another person, then the man is called a murderer. If that man kills 100 people, then the person is declared mentally insane, and if the person kills thousands of people, then he's going to be invited to peace negotiations to Geneva. That's how it goes, right? And there's obviously a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of truth in that. So oftentimes the power and then actually also the authority to sit on a negotiation table grows out of the barrel of a gun, which it obviously shouldn't. And we know all of this in terms of the research that we do, and we've had fantastic figures and very, very important figures. But simply the question to you, so how pessimistic, optimistic are you that all of your great work is actually gonna make a difference towards the better? And my request, when you answer that question, be optimistic.
Yeah. You're asking for a bit too much. The big question and being optimistic, it's a big task, but very sobering joke that I think requires a very sobering answer as well. When atrocities are committed by head of states, unfortunately, we have to recognize that in some cases, these head of states are more or less elected by democratic processes, right? And so there are certain limits, and Rebecca and Fabrizio, correct me if you're wrong, but there are certain limits in which the United Nations can go. I believe it's the not interfering with internal affairs, right? So if one head of state is recognized by its population as the leader of that country, then he is the person entitled to enter negotiation processes, because that's how it is. It's not that, and obviously this is a simplistic answer, but it's the international community, I think, has limit, and I don't want to give specific example, but in certain cases the international community has limited, can put pressure, can put sanctions, for instance, can put economic incentives for leaders to behave in a certain way. But ultimately, I don't know how to find an optimistic answer to this. I'm sorry.
I understand, yeah.
But maybe I'll think about it and then I can chime in later. But I wanted to share my thoughts also to answer the question of the gentleman, or the comments of the gentleman in the front. I think you were speaking music to my ears, meaning that, of course, we need to, and it's a strive that I think everybody here is doing, to highlight how there are gendered impacts to the use of weapons. Women are disproportionately affected by certain type of weapons. I could give millions of examples. For instance, after the attacks with chemical weapons in Syria, it was demonstrated. There are very interesting studies that I suggest. I always suggest studies, but as a researcher, that's what I do. And there is this very interesting studies published by ILPI that demonstrated how the death rate of women following the chemical attacks in Syria in 2012 and forward was almost double the death rate of men. And this wasn't because of biological differences between men and women. Obviously, chemical weapons also have different impacts based on biology, and maybe we can talk about that later. But one of the reasons why women were the most affected was because of gender norms that impeded a very quick medical procedures after the attack. So namely, after a chemical attack, victims need to be completely undressed right away, and all the chemical agents need to be washed off. And this, in most cases, in Syria was not possible because maybe the medical personnel were men, and so women in certain cultures are not allowed to be seen naked by men, or the medical personnel were not necessarily knowledgeable of the reproductive needs of these women that were attacked. So certainly there's so much more to do and so much more work that needs to be done to uncover this gender impact and to uncover how women are disproportionately affected by, like, as you said, in the domestic level, in the national level, international level. But I also want to add that highlighting highlighting and recognizing the suffering of one group, in this case women, doesn't necessarily mean that all the resources should be taken away from highlighting the suffering of other groups, in this case queer groups. So I think it's important to, it's important to highlight women's rights, absolutely right, but that doesn't mean that it should be the only focus.
Thank you, Fabrizio.
Thank you. On your question, I don't know if I feel optimistic or if I find an optimistic answer. I don't know, in the great scale of history, I remember in the 80s when I was a kid, there were families that were buying also nuclear bunkers. So we experienced also times in our communities, our societies, experienced times where the political tensions, the Cold War, were probably at higher level compared to nowadays. So maybe we should not lose faith also in the international community and the instruments of that we have as the United Nations, that is an organization is a place for, as Nicola, you were saying, is a place for governments to get together and to talk. So this is, let's say, our role. At the same time, we are facing multiple challenges, and I try to answer your question on why Africa is so prominent on in the statistics of killings or intentional killings of women and girls. It's much broader. I mean, there are different components. We are actually studying. We have a special focus on the African continent in a report that we will publish soon. So we are looking at different components. There is, of course, the demographic push on one side, the urbanization push on the other side, the climate change that is mainly affecting rural communities. And as a matter of fact, rural community, the African continent, we see more rural communities in the African continent. So this pressure is creating, let's say, these social tensions that could justify or be a not justify, but be a motivation beyond these statistics. And beside, homicide statistics are not the only indicators where the African continent is, let's say, unfortunately, let's say, popping up in terms of drugs and crime. Yes, maybe to address also your point, I just can echo, let's say, what has been said. I just make a point from the criminologist point of view, is that we need to address let's say, the issue of, as you were saying, women being particularly affected by violence and by homicides in this case. Sometimes we also need to understand why males are so violent, just from the social science point of view. Thanks.
Thank you. Dragan?
So, yeah, I will start with the hard question. Well, basically, types of conflict, then we see how the social norms and rules, how they easily collapse. But I still believe that many of our efforts, which are either related on increasing the participation of women on small arms control or promoting some other more transformative forms of masculinity, they still in long run contribute to the peace building and conflict prevention. Although it's from this specific historic point of time, it's not that easy to be optimistic, but it's still that it's still important to highlight this. When it comes to remark on women in Southeast Europe, there is really a lot of very practical initiatives how to combat the misuse of firearms in domestic violence, which has highlighted several times by all speakers, disproportionately affects women. And I believe that there is really a lot of going on to, for instance, to work with police officers, with prosecutors, with media, so that we all contribute and deliver to for increased women safety, particularly in their homes.
Dragan, thank you very much. And that basically brings us to the end of our event. Thanks a lot to our presenters. Perhaps a big round of applause, because they really deserve it. Thanks a lot to the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs for crossing the Danube, the mighty Danube River, And it was wonderful to do this event together. Perhaps we can do things like that in the future as well. And thanks a lot to the audience for asking lots of very, very good questions. And I'm sorry about the 2 questions I didn't take anymore. And please feel free to approach the panelists. Okay? Thanks a lot for being here.